So I want to, in a sense, go back. Let me get this up here. Organized. Go back to the beginning. And I want to ask you about the first piece that's in the book, newly edited, Leaves from the Notebook of a Tamed Cynic, a very youthful Niebuhr, developing his theological muscles, reflections on simplicity and complexity, the beginnings of a strong and growing political voice. I'd just like for you to say something about that piece, why it has such staying power. For many undergraduates still today in the United States, it's the one piece they know. And what did your father think of that book?
Oh, I can answer that. Is it working really? No. Is this one's better? Yes, I can tell it's better.
Yeah, that one's good.
Okay. Yes. My father, let me start again. Having worked in the book business all my life, all my adult life, I know I've heard from many, many writers how disappointed they are when people tell them that their favorite book by the writer is his first book. Like, why did I go to all the trouble of writing all those other ones that won prizes and stuff if you think my first book is the best? I heard that from many writers. And my father was not unlike this. This was his most juvenile book written or compiled, really, because it's compiled from diary entries that he kept from 1915 until 1928. He compiled when he didn't know very much, when a lot of things that mattered to him enormously and issues about which his views were taken seriously in the years to come, all of that was in the future. And there was nothing for him to write about except, except his experiences as a pastor in Detroit, where he was for those years. So I think he felt that that it was a minor, small, juvenile book. But the reason it's so successful, I think, apart from the fact that it's very well written, I get to say that, he never would, but I will, is that students I've never talked to students about this, but I've talked to pastors who were tremendously grateful for this book when they themselves first took over a parish. To be acquainted with the fears and uncertainties and doubts that afflicted a young pastor trying to do the work not only of preaching, which is already a big deal, but also of running the parish and paying attention to the parishioners. Some of the most moving sections of this book are my father's ruminations about how absurd it is for him to think that he has anything to teach or give some of the older members of his congregation who are sick or ailing or on their deathbeds. Who am I to tell them about life? They're telling me about life, was basically his view. And the humility and straightforwardness of that view was true to him. That's what he was like. And also matters to many people for the decades since the book was first published. It's never been out of print. So I heard mostly about it from pastors, so many of them former students of his here at Union, who would be very grateful for the wisdom in the book about life in a parish. Now, there's also, there's plenty of evidence, as our absent friend Gary Dorian has pointed out, that my father no sooner got to Bethel Evangelical Church in Detroit than he was roaring around the country, leaving the administration of the church to his mother. And that may be true too. But nonetheless, the truth in this book, which doesn't talk about his running around, it just talks about him and his parishioners. It's not quite completely true. There are a few other chapters that go further afield. But that was also a fundamental truth of his experience in Detroit, and he cared about it greatly.
So in the book, one of the most remarkable sections to me, it was a delight to read through the leaves again. And then if you all have not seen the book, it covers Moral Man and Immoral Society, selections from Children of Light and Children of Darkness, The Irony of American History. And then there's the section called Other Writings, which is a stunning compilation of political writings and sermons and reflections. So when I came upon the political writings sections, which is the largest section of the book, I was astounded by the sheer volume and scope of it. These are writings he was just cranking out in a number of publications, speaking out on current issues, from Prohibition to Vietnam. And in conversations with you, I discovered this was just a small fraction of his actual political writings. So talk to us about the role that those direct political writings played in his own sort of daily processes of thinking, and how you decided which ones to put in and which ones to not include. That must have been an incredible set of decisions. So,
to take your last question first, the question of what to include and what to exclude was helped by the draconian measures imposed by my publisher, the marvelous Max Rudin here. Can I have just two more? No, Elizabeth, you've already got. No, I think actually, Serene, it's not the biggest section by page length. It looks big because there are lots of short essays in it. But here was the thing. I'm going to also answer a question you didn't ask, which is, where is his magnum opus, The Nature and Destiny of Man, which was his largest and most and theologically most significant book, which he wrote as he prepared as the Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh during the war, in 2 volumes, Human Nature, Human Destiny. After much discussion, I did not feel that I had the authority as a non-theologian to decide that this should or should not be in the book. But I knew that if it was put in, there would be a lot of things that couldn't go in. I mean, it was just a matter of space. So I consulted with the nicest and best Niebuhr scholars I could find, many of whom supported the notion of just leaving it out entirely and making sure that there were essays from later in his career, written in the 50s and even into the 60s, that covered some of the important themes for which the nature and destiny of man had become known. Indeed, Robin Lovin, the impeccable Robin Lovin, said, actually, he may have even expressed these positions better a little later on, which made me feel better about leaving out that book. How I made how did I make the choices? I wanted very much to have sermons in this book because that, as my mother said, was his art form. He might have done lectures and newspaper articles and pieces for the liberal left-wing press, but his art form was sermons. And so I wanted to have them. And, well, they were, and I made another decision there. There are gazillions of recordings of my father preaching that have never been transcribed, and I didn't go there. I decided my position had to be that I would only include sermons that he himself had prepared for publication. I know as an editor how dangerously complex transcribing the spoken word to the written page is, and so it made sense to just use the ones that he had already chosen. So there are books that have quite a lot of sermons in them. Discerning the Signs of the Time, Beyond Tragedy, which is secretly my favorite book of his, I think. And other books have sermons, so I had to pick and choose a few sermons from those books. Then it made sense, as I looked at the chronology, to include some lectures where he had been asked to lecture on such and so, or had chosen because of the context in which he was lecturing to talk about such and such. And those too are in some of his books. So those got chosen too. And then the one that looks like the longest are the short articles he wrote, as you said, for the Nation and the New Leader and the New Republic. And not for Christianity in Crisis, a magazine he started himself with his colleague and cherished friend, John Bennett, once the President of Union, but not then yet in the 1940s, Wonderful man, John Bennett. I didn't use any of the material from Christianity in Crisis either, because that was also kind of, if I swim into that swamp, I'll never get out. I mean, he was churning out material for C&C for decades. So I thought, if I had had a vast staff and 6 research assistants, maybe I would have looked through the C&C, but I didn't, so I didn't. And there was, Lord knows, there was enough material anyway from all the other sources. So then it seemed to me right to make sure that issues that I knew had been important to him at the time were represented in the subject matter of the essays that I chose. I also wanted to settle a few scores. In the 1960s, and at the height of and in the late 60s, my father was frequently described as a semi-reactionary, cold warrior who didn't understand the political significance of the New Left. And I knew that was wrong. I just knew that was wrong. And many of those voices would go on to say, he doesn't care about the Vietnam War, he doesn't care about the civil rights movement, he's blah, 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 all of which were calumnies as far as I was concerned. Leaving aside the biographical truth that he was very ill and had had several strokes and couldn't leave his home, whereas before, during his active years, he had traveled all over the country. Leaving that aside, I knew that his opposition to the Vietnam War, for example, was deep and constant from the beginning, from before it became a subject of debate even, and similarly with the civil rights material. If you know where to look in Moral Man and Immoral Society, or in other writings of his from the 1930s, and if you knew about his active life in the South, working with sometimes with students of his from the South who would come to Union to study with him, he kept an eye on them when they returned to the South to work in any way they could to break the stranglehold of white supremacy in the South. It just seemed to me wrong not to have that well and fully mentioned in the incidental essays. So I made sure that they were there. Yes, those were the 2 scores I felt I wanted to settle. Maybe there were others that I can't now remember. But it seemed kind of easy at the end, to tell you the honest truth. They fell into place. There were the essays on the Vietnam War. Oh, another contentious issue, which I spoke with some of you about before this evening began, was his position on Israel. During the war, in 1941 and 42 and 43, he was among the very few public figures in America who were advocating for a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which he saw as a plausible response to this fabulously urgent issue in 1942, 43. And to him, and I want to underline this, to him it made sense that forming a new nation for the Jewish people in the Middle East made sense because there was going to be a lot of other nation forming in the Middle East. When he was writing, there weren't nations in the Middle East. There was the British Mandate and the French Mandate covering territories and tribes and cities that had ancient and complex histories, but not national histories. So everybody knew that after the war, hoping for the United Nations to preside over this and for Great Britain and France to assist in it, that there would be new nations carved out of the Middle East, and that one for the Jewish people should be one of them. He made that very clear, and I have included material that shows how clear it was to him then. And that's an important thing to stress now, because just within the past year or two, he has been called immoral and unethical for his support of Israel in 1940, of an Israel. It wasn't an Israel yet, a Jewish home in Palestine for the Jewish people. So you see how fashions in politics change. But so I wanted to include that too.
So what was it like? Or give us a description of a day in the life of an intellect that is going from writing on Israel to preaching a sermon in chapel, to giving a lecture in a classroom, to speaking out at a rally in Midtown. What, I mean, how
You left out the baptizing one of his students' babies.
and baptizing the baby in the midst of it all, and having students around constantly. I mean, how did he make these decisions about how to spend his time so that this just enormous amount of production was actually able to take place? What enabled that?
Well, I think he was very efficient, to be honest, and he could work in the midst of a great hue and cry of children and students and doorbells ringing and God knows what. He was able somehow to focus. So that there was that temperamental gift that he had. Another gift he had, and it's a gift of temperament, I find very hard to explain. I discovered how difficult it was to explain when I went off to college and first met a lot of people who knew my father's name and knew he was famous but didn't know what he was like, and assumed, because everybody assumes this about really famous people, that he must have been sort of formidable. He wasn't at all, and his students didn't think so. He was an approachable, friendly, modest person. In my adult life, I have had cause to meet many, as my mother would say, admirals, judges, bishops, she would say in her sarcastic English way, meaning grand men who take possession of a room when they walk into it, and you know right away that they're very important. Well, my father wasn't like that at all. So that saves a lot of time. I mean, you just get down to you don't, it does, it really does. But then, as I may have said to you, and I've thought aloud about this, but I haven't really proved it, as it were. But in compiling these materials, I could see, I felt, a pattern where something, not necessarily a current event, it could also be a scriptural passage or a theological problem that interested him and that he cared about tackling that particular week because something that had happened, or because he was asked to talk about such and such a subject. And so he would, and those themes would turn up in a sermon, and then they would turn up in an article, and then they would turn up in a chapter of a book. Never repeating himself, but sort of thinking through what he really believed about these subjects. And so I think that kind of, I don't want to talk about cows and their three stomachs, do I? No, I don't want to do that. But you get my idea. the regurgitation of these materials. I think that also animated his energy and his productivity. Let's put it that way. How was it? He had a wonderfully efficient secretary, Mrs. Moores, who kept track of all his comings and goings. He worked, as I said, in the middle of chaos, if chaos presented itself, and so he was good at that. And he was good at focusing. I don't know how else to put it.
So talk about the role his teaching and his conversation with his students played in all of this intellectual fullness and as you described, noise. I mean, it's happening in the midst of noise, but talk about his being as a teacher.
Well, I will, and I'd like to, because I think he was a fine teacher, but I also have to say I never sat in a classroom where he was teaching, so I just never did that. To be honest, when I was an adolescent growing up here, that was the last place in the world I wanted to find myself, so I didn't. But he loved engaging with his students, and I know that because he and my mother became rather well known in the seminary community for their weekly at-homes, they were called, Thursday evenings. They became notorious, not only famous, but notorious because they served beer at them sometimes, and that was frowned upon in this gathering. But they were very lively parties. That was the main thing. And the students loved coming to my parents' house to talk to them and to schmooze with them and to gossip with them. And they liked the gossip, which was political gossip usually. And I agree with my father's dear friend, the late Arthur Schlesinger, who believed that Pa liked hanging out with politicians and political figures because pastors bored him. Now, that's not fair to many pastors who were his dear friends. But we all know the tone of sanctimonious piety that can fall over a group of pastors, and that he fled from. It's not an accident that he married an extremely skeptical, witty, outspoken, profoundly pious, but skeptical-sounding Englishwoman. So the at-homes were lively and fun, and his students liked the fact that he took them seriously. I think that's the way to put it. And many of them expressed gratitude later for the fact that he had done so. I mentioned some of the students who came north to study with him and then went back to the south. Two of his favorites were Jim Dombrowski and Miles Horton. Miles Horton was the founder of the Highlander School in Tennessee, which was the school where all the earliest civil rights activists in the 1950s learned how to do nonviolent civil disobedience. You don't just start doing it, you have to learn how to do it. And the Highlander School, of many of its virtues, one of them was that was where they trained people like Rosa Parks and all the others. So Miles Horton and Dombrowski and others who took on parishes in large cities or small towns, all of them remembered his practical sense of the problem of representing the Christian word in the public sphere. And they liked his, I think they liked his acknowledgement of difficulty and the fact that he gave the impression that he was still thinking about these things himself. He hadn't worked them all out. I think that's a fair way to put it. Does that help you?
No. And one of the things that's interesting to me in our conversations is the description you gave of the union of the 40s and the 50s. To read his writing, it would appear to be a very activist union, but in fact, what you described to me was a union where the Pentateuch paper was the pressing issue of the day. Talk a little bit just about the
October and
environment.
November, the Pentateuch paper was important for the first-year students. I'd like to say that I feel my own memories of Union are inflected by his own complicated feelings about instruction at the graduate level in theology and scriptures, because he himself was not very well educated in these regards, and he knew it. And he had been conflicted and uncertain about his work at the Yale Divinity School, which he attended for 2 years. He knew that many of his fellow faculty members were much more formidable scholars than he would ever be. And he didn't really want to be. I mean, he just knew he was a different kettle of fish. So he had a kind of complicated feeling of tremendous respect and also great edginess about the pedagogic issues presented at Union. But he deeply liked the fact that the students were both pastors to be and scholars to be. And as you very well put it in your introductory remarks, having those two things together were very important for him. So I'm not answering your question, but I'm trying to suggest that the seriousness of the work being done here, the school work, he took very seriously and respected greatly. And I said to Serene that I remember that I thought that I was the only person in the 4th grade who had ever heard the phrase Pentateuch paper. But the fact was that the Old Testament course that every first-year student at Union had to take had as its first big requirement a term paper on the Pentateuch. So you had to do it, and you had to know what it was, and you had to be able to engage in discussing it. So, yes, I remember that. I also remember the weekly chapel services in this chapel, and the daily services in the little chapel. What's the little chapel's name? Lampman Chapel.
Every
Thank
day?
you.
Small ones?
Little ones, yes.
And only once a week in here.
And once, well, maybe twice. I mean, always on Sunday mornings here. There may have been other services in the James Chapel, but the Sunday morning ones were the ones I remember, which we did not always attend. My father was very often away on the weekends because he was off preaching somewhere else. He rode circuit around the United States, preaching mostly in college chapels, not in well-established churches whose pastors more or less disapproved of him as a fiery, red-baiting, I don't know what, left-winger. There were only two churches in the United States that actually regularly invited him to preach, but he did preach regularly in many colleges and universities. So he wasn't around very much. And in some of the Sundays when he wasn't here, my mother and I would go to the cathedral at St. John the Divine. She was, after all, an Anglican, and she liked to have some doses of a liturgical service. But we very often came to James Chapel too, of course. Also, there was a lot of camaraderie around eating. We often went to supper at the refectory.
So describe to us what the refectory was like.
Oh,
White tablecloths, waiter, what?
No.
What was it?
Trays, and it was a cafeteria, sort of.
So what happened in the big upper place where the faculty, we've been told the faculty ate in the faculty dining room. Up above the refectory, there's a special dining room?
News to me.
Oh, so you never went there.
News to me. I only knew the refectory. And then there were regular sort of holiday-related parties in the social room. And so the students had a chance to see their professors cavorting a bit. That was always nice. There was lots of music. So yes, there was a lot of community effect around this. It felt like a community of students and younger faculty and older faculty. There were some faculty members who did not participate in this very much, but there were others who were regulars, and my father was one of them.
So this is a question about you. One of the great delights I have as president when I greet people who return to Union, I hear the stories of the children who grew up running around these buildings and all the secret passageways and nooks and crannies and all of the, what it's like to grow up in a castle almost.
It was like that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that.
I'll explain about the secret passages first, because that's the subject, the topic that most people care about. Union Seminary is connected to Barnard and to Columbia by a series of underground passages that are also called steam tunnels, because the steam pipes connect them. And growing up at Union, one of the things you learned when you were old enough to be judged by your elders and betters among the kids would be to get them to show you where these were. I haven't seen most of my fellow faculty brat friends for the longest time, except for Hugh Van Dusen, one of the three sons of the president of Union through much of this time, Henry Pitney Van Dusen. And Hugh, I think, was the one who showed me where the secret tunnels were. But they weren't secret to us. We just loved the idea that if push came to shove, we could go from 99 Claremont to 110th and Broadway underground. I don't know if anybody ever did, but we did that. And there was a lot of playing in the quadrangle, actually, but I can't tell you what it was. I don't remember it that well because there were a lot of boys who were 3 or 4 years older than I, so that you must ask René Tillich or Hugh Van Dusen or one of them what was really going on. The Van Dusens always had a Christmas party with lots and lots of Christmas carols, which we all sang together. Ethel Porter she was the wife of the professor of sacred music, playing the piano. There were lots of faculty get-togethers, which would always include students as well, that we children got to enjoy too. So it was a real community. It truly was a real community. And there was something impressive, I thought, thinking about it later after I'd been exposed to other academic communities. I thought it was splendid the way such different and diverse people all seemed to get along together. Richard Kroner, professor of New Testament theology, was a rather formidable and austere man. But he seemed to get along just fine with Harry Emerson Fosdick or Jim Meilenberg, the aforementioned professor of Old Testament, with John Bennett. These were all very different people, but they respected each other. And may I say, Serene, since I feel I must say, the wives also got along. My mother had been trained as a theologian and had come here to study theology. That's how she met my father. And people presumed, as you know, people love to come to stupid conclusions about types of women who do this, that, and the other thing. So people presumed that since she wasn't the typical faculty wife, since she was herself teaching religion at Barnard after the 1940s, that she probably didn't get along with the wives of professors who were stay-at-home wives. Nonsense. They were all friends, and they got along just fine. And anybody who knows anything about wives of pastors knows that that's a full-time job. I mean, you have a lot of work to do. In any case, she and they all got along fine. I'm not saying things were easy. I'm just saying they were cordial and companionable.
And were there ever huge political differences or disagreements between the faculty and the students and your father in these gatherings because of the firebrand, the intensity of the topics being discussed was not. I mean, this was not lightweight stuff.
No, that's true. I think there was some concern in the Niebuhr family that the Van Dusens were a little too close to the Republican Party and seemed to favor types who were, anyway, even if they weren't. And there was some concern about that. That actually bubbled up about Billy Graham. The Billy Graham into something that I've had to correct a number of scholars about, which is about Billy Graham. The Billy Graham scholars like to believe that my father refused to meet with him. Well, if anybody ever knew anything about my father, then it was just nonsense. Of course he would meet with him. Why not? But if you put the request to meet with my father in the context of the 1952 presidential campaign, when Graham was supporting Eisenhower and sliming Adlai Stevenson, my father's Illinois friend and preferred candidate, you can see that maybe he didn't want quite to talk to Billy Graham at that juncture when Graham came to New York to have one of his big crusades here, at which time he made clear his own political preferences. I don't know for a fact what exactly happened, but I'm almost sure that sure, come up and I'll see if I can get Riney for you, but it never eventuated into any. But it was not a political battle between them. Susan probably said to Graham, because they knew each other, that sure, come up and I'll see if I can get Riney for you, but it never eventuated into any. But it was not a political battle between them. There were a great many members of the Union community whose politics I am completely ignorant of. I mean, I don't know whether they were political even. Certainly John Bennett and the Bennetts and the Niebuhrs and a few others were definitely energetic Democrats, but I can't remember a lot of the others. Paul Shearer, I'm not sure if he was political or not. I mean, and if so, what tone he took. Silver-haired professor of homiletics, for those of you who don't recognize the name. Paul Shearer, wonderful man.
So as you know, even today, Union, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is still a campus where all of the faculty live here together and half of the student body is residential. So the residential life is not secondary to the education, but considered part of the education, and the deep formation that happens when you live together. And at Union, in New York City, that always means living with people who are different from you.
Absolutely.
So talk about how those differences felt then, what they were like.
My active memory of this goes back to my childhood, because once I was old enough to go to college, I left, and I really can't speak about what Union was like then from the mid-50s on, but I do remember in the early 50s, in the late 40s, let us say. And I can tell you two things. I can tell you that the student body in the late 40s, my father said later, was one of the best 3 or 4 years of students that he ever had. These were veterans. Many of them were older than usual, and they had fought in the Pacific Theater or in Europe, and they were really serious about their faith and about their desire to make something valuable out of the remains of their days. And my father enormously liked teaching them, and they were from all over, from all sorts of different places. They may have been more white than more of them were white than perhaps should have been, but they were a very diverse group of white people, if you know what I mean. They were from all kinds of backgrounds, and my father enjoyed that. Another thing one can say about the 1950s is that many differences were simply never discussed. You didn't go into it. It wasn't polite. In 1954, I think it was, one of the students at Union killed himself by throwing himself off the tower of Riverside Church. And have you heard about this? And it was shattering for the Union community, and shattering especially for his roommate, who hadn't known that his roommate was gay. That's what the 1950s were like. I'm not blaming this on, at any rate, the student who killed himself was a wonderful person, and so was the roommate who was shattered by this horrible event.
Guthrie Spears.
Guthrie Spears, exactly. Wonderful man, Guthrie Spears. Yes, and he became a great friend of my family's. Guthrie did. The students who became best friends with my parents in those years, in 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, were the ones who were least sanctimoniously clerical in the way that my mother so disliked. I think a lot of us dislike, frankly.
We still do.
Still do, exactly. And those were the years when my father had a series of strokes and was disabled and unable to preach, unable to lecture. And the students that he liked seeing then were the students who made him laugh and cheered him up and so on. And Guthrie was one of them.
So 32 years in one place, deeply forming a community. Any last thoughts for us on his end of life reflections on that period of time? And as he looked back on it, how did he experience in his aging that time here?
Yes, he left Union physically in 1961, and he moved away from New York to Massachusetts some years later. But he stayed in touch, of course, with Union in one way or another. And his response and his thoughts about Union were like every Niebuhrian thing, very complicated and full of paradox and irony. He loved being here. He loved teaching here. He deeply respected and admired his colleagues. But he did not think that Union was immune from the problems that he had preached against his whole life of sanctimonious, self-congratulatory ease with being a good middle-class Christian. And it bothered him that that was still evident not only in the American church at large, but also even here at Union. Parenthesis, this was a subject he talked about with one of his best friends in his old age, and that was Rabbi Heschel from across the street, who had very much the same feeling about the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he was both a revered and respected member of the faculty, but also a little bit not accepted by the more conventional teachers there. So I think this had become his home, and he knew that, and he was grateful for it, and he spoke of it always with respect and affection. But there was always the Niebuhrian undercurrent of uncertainty as to whether the enterprise had been done as well as it could be done.
Did you discover anything new about him as you worked on these papers?
I guess when I saw the volume of work and the attention that each new task, article, lecture, series of lectures, sermons, when I saw the volume of the material, I thought, oh goodness, he was very patient. I didn't think of him as a patient person because he was always in high gear and moving very rapidly. But when I saw the work, I thought, and this is in his first pastoral book, The Leaves from the Notebook of a Tame Cynic, and it's in the later work too, there's a kind of patience and awareness of difficulty that moves me greatly to think of, because it was a daily reality for him. And certainly after he was ill, it became so. He was very outspoken, though, about what he felt were dangerous habits of mind and spirit that could lull you into accepting unacceptable things, to paraphrase a part of one of his famous prayers. He wrote to his friend Will Scarlett, who had then retired Bishop of Missouri, who was retired in Maine and having great fights with young Episcopalians in the church about this or that and the other thing. And the two of them compared notes about how difficult it was to go on arguing in your own church for things you've been saying for 50 years. And in one of his letters to Will Scarlett, he said, maybe all these different churches, Methodist. We haven't said enough, by the way, about how important it was that there were people from every denomination in this seminary. Most seminaries in America are single denomination ones. So Union was especially important because it welcomed students from every denomination. And my father said to Uncle Will, maybe all these churches are absolutely indigestible, and you can only feel comfortable in the one you were brought up in, because they all have so many flaws. and when you look at them objectively, they seem so inadequate. So maybe you just have to grow up in one and then that's the one you can live with. Now, he wouldn't want that to be the concluding note, but there was a kind of patience and attentive energy to the daily tasks that I think I didn't appreciate when I was growing up, but do now.
And was there, as the last word, you're a wonderful editor and writer in your own right. So the experience of editing not just another writer, but your own father must be have its own character. And so can you just close out with some,
Yes.
Also a question, were you surprised or changed in yourself in this process of going through this material?
First of all, I have to say that I don't think of what I was doing as editing my father, if you see what I
No,
mean. I
yes,
was
sir.
putting together material that had been edited and published, and all I was doing was... So if this job had required me to edit text, I would have been a psychological wreck, and I don't think I would have done the job. I would have said, no, I can't do that. I already have enough difficulty dealing with people who write to ask me how much my mother intervened in editing my father's work, and that means in the textual editing sense, and that's already complicated. I would never dream of changing a word of published Niebuhr text at all, but I did enjoy assembling this. I will say partly because Max and his team gave me such wonderful moral and technical support, and I had wonderful advice and help in assembling this book. I'm very far from doing it by myself. Mr. Gibbon, I'm channeling him, right? Jim Gibbon. So I think I learned to come home again, if you know what I mean. I had spent a lot of time moving away from the Niebuhr shadow, or light. And I felt comfortable coming back home and being in Niebuhr again as I put this book together. I think that's true. And that makes me, I hope, still a member of this community.
Yes, wow. Wow, thank you.
What? Oh, up to you. Up to you. You decide. Yeah.
So we're going to just take a few minutes for maybe 2 or 3 questions. You all have been a rapt audience, so you must have thoughts and questions running through your own mind as you hear these reflections. Yes?
I can't hear you.
Were there discussions about Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Oh, yes.
Here, pick up.
I'm sorry. Were there discussions about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? I don't remember them here. Well, first of all, I was 5 years old, so my adult command of this material is not strong. Secondly, Hiroshima and Nagasaki took place in the summer when we were not here. I certainly remember the conversations at the family dinner table about this in August. I don't remember it before then, but then I was just a little girl and I didn't know from nothing. But the conversations about it continued in the years after. And for me, rose to a particularly high and valuable point valuable for my father when he spent a year at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he was able to talk to Oppenheimer and to a number of other of the physicists who had been with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. And again, my father just treasured these conversations because those physicists were in anguish about how to assess the ethical consequences and ways of thinking about what they had contributed in the war effort at Los Alamos. And they were very tense, anguished conversations. And I think they valued my father's listening to them and conversing with them. And I know my father valued their responses. And I think he felt he learned more about how horrible the whole thing was. It didn't make him feel better about it. And he had signed letters opposing especially the Nagasaki bombing. But that's important to stress, because there are Niebuhr critics who, I nearly had a heart attack, my blood pressure dropped or spiked or something, when I read Stanley Hauerwas's remark that Niebuhr was the theologian of Hiroshima. That was the beginning, you see, of his Cold Warrior period. You know, it made me very angry, and I thought so much about those anguished, enlightening, difficult conversations he had had with Oppenheimer. That was in the 1960s. It was still an unsolved, difficult problem, and it still is today. One of the horrible things, I think, about American public discourse now is that nobody thinks about this anymore. Nobody knows about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And generations of Americans have grown up thinking they're just sort of bigger weapons. They're not just bigger weapons. They're a completely new kind of weapon, and they cannot be ever used. So yes, I remember lots of conversations, but not from the very beginning.
Yes,
I don't know of anybody, but everything has changed. The kinds of publications in which he was taken seriously, which included Life and Time and Newsweek, don't exist anymore. And if they do, they're run by people who have no interest in what a left-wing cleric from Union Seminary has to say about anything. There were specific reasons that Henry Luce was interested in my father's work, and they can't be replicated. And it wasn't just my father. Luce was interested in a number of theological characters. So the public platforms on which such people were welcome don't exist anymore. And society has become fractionated much more than we ever thought. I can attest to that in another way, which is that in the 1940s and 50s, let alone the 30s, which of course I can't speak to, but in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s, there was a great availability of people who were here, there, and everywhere to sort of know each other. Community organizers working with Alinsky, working with Alinsky, and Jacques Maritain, the great French theologian, and my father, and the publisher of the Washington Post were all friends. You can't imagine that now. You know? I mean, labor people, labor union representatives, scholars, writers, activists, all kind of, drank the same coffee and attended the same parties. And that's gone too. So I don't know how you could begin to have that kind of command of the public ear anymore. There's another difficulty now, I think, and that is that people who want to speak strongly about things are forgetting one of the most important things that my father never forgot, and that is that however fierce you are and however demanding your interpretation is, you must be polite and tactful, for God's sake. So there are certain words you don't use, and there are certain ways of speaking that you don't employ. And if for anybody who has any knowledge whatsoever of the social media, that this has gone completely. The measure of how strongly you feel about something is how obnoxious and obscene you can be in expressing your views. That is absolutely not the way public discourse was handled 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Not a very cheerful answer, I'm afraid.
We have two questions, one in the back and then John. You can end the last question.
Before he was elected President, Barack Obama, in an interview with David Brooks, named your father as, I think, his favorite or one of his favorite philosophers. Do you see your father's legacy played out in his political agenda as he has been president?
Yes, I do, actually. I'm a tremendous supporter of and respecter of our president. And I'm also among the many strong supporters of him who are disappointed that he hasn't been able to do more or has failed to engage in certain big issues because he can't succeed at them. But I think his Niebuhrianism is genuine, actually, and it's best expressed recently in these two wonderful the interviews with Marilyn Robinson that have been published in the New York Review of Books, where he comes across as a Niebuhrian for sure. And I think the great speech that he gave in Cairo in the first year of his presidency was a very Niebuhrian speech. And there are others. I think he knew what he was talking about. And I respect that. But that doesn't mean that I think that the continuation of the war in Afghanistan or the beginning of our confusions in Syria are Niebuhrian in any way, because they're not. But there we are.
So you mentioned Heschel, and we're having an event next week in which we commemorate his great speech here, his lecture, No Religion is an Island. And arguably that is one of his great relationships. If you're going to mention Niebuhr, you probably at some point have also to mention Heschel as a friend. But the other person is who would probably have to be mentioned would be Tillich, too. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these relationships and the way in which, particularly these two relationships, shaped and framed your father's life and thought.
Well, Heschel, the relationship with Heschel couldn't influence my father's life and thought because they didn't meet until they were both quite old. But they became quick and fast friends, and they respected each other and loved each other, I think. I have to quote my mother here because she observed this as I did not. I was not any longer in the Niebuhr household, and I can't swear to all of this, but I have discussed this with Susanna Heschel, Rabbi Heschel's rabbi daughter, and we've discussed these matters. My mother used to say that the two words that meant a great deal to Rabbi Heschel and meant a great deal to Reinhold were mystery and meaning, that there was some way in which you have to understand that there is a deep mystery at the heart of the most meaningful sacred moments or spiritual commitments. And they both felt that. And they appreciated it in each other, I think. As to Tillich is very different, of course. Tillich turns up here in 1934 because my father persuaded the then president of Union, Henry Sloane Coffin, to find some money to give him a professorship. And President Coffin, together with Columbia, combined to make a professorship that Tillich could take when he was thrown out of the University of Frankfurt, where he was called, may I just say this, where he was called Paul among the Jews, the Frankfurt faculty being most famous for their Jewish sociologists and political theorists. They liked each other and got along, but they were temperamentally, and if I can put it this way, culturally very different. Tillich's interest in the arts and music and the relationship of religion to arts was of no interest whatsoever to my father. My father's way of being political was not particularly to Uncle Paulus's taste. It wasn't that he disapproved of it, but they went through the world in different worlds, and the kind of quasi-bohemian artistic world of New York City that the Tillichs fully participated in was not something that my father was particularly interested in. But they liked each other. And I think there's no gainsaying, although I can't prove this, I just know it in my heart, that their common concern with Germany from 1934 to 45 was absolutely a bond that was unbreakable between them. And I didn't fully understand that until I read, when they were finally translated into English, and I hadn't even known about these before. When I finally read the addresses to the German people that Tillich wrote during the war and broadcast from down at Radio City into Germany, very political, very outspoken, very brave, and very eloquent speeches to Germans about what they were bringing on themselves during those years. Fantastic speeches, every one of which my father would have approved of. And they served together on various boards or committees of people to help not only Jews from Germany, but other people from Germany, and to help people who wanted to insist that Germany had a right to expect, or a right to hope for and work for a democratic nation after the war. You'd be amazed how many people didn't think the Germans could do that. But Uncle Paulus and my father insisted that this had to be the basis on which you would support Germans during the war. That is, they were both interested in the resistance to Hitler. So that was a big bond between them, I think. There were many things that were not a bond, and many things even that divided them. But I think those were unbreakable. And I also, I'll just say this because I loved listening to Tillich's sermons, which were completely different from my father's and wonderfully magisterial in a kind of German professorial way. Fantastic.
So just to say again, thank you for this.
Stagehand, too. Thank you, Elizabeth and Serene, for a very compelling and illuminating conversation. Elizabeth, you used the word light a few minutes ago, and I think you really brought a great deal of light to our understanding and appreciation for life at Union. You gave us a real sense of your father as a man and a writer and a committed political thinker, and also some feeling for what the Union community was like in those days. So bravo, tremendous. The Reinhold Niebuhr volume is the 263rd volume in the Library of America series. But most of the writers that we've published, like Melville and Edith Wharton and Frederick Douglass are long dead. And so we never have the opportunity, or rarely, to know a child or a close relative of the writer. But when we do, as in this case, it really brings the writer to life and reminds us of the continuum between writers of the past and writers now. Library of America functions, our mission is really to be the keeper of the flame. That is, to make sure that America's great writers continue to have a role in the cultural conversation, that we keep them alive. And you can see how tonight's conversation really brings that into focus very much. This writing isn't dead, it's very much alive in the culture. And we don't have many theologians in the series yet, but we have a great range of books in the Library of America, from sports writing to screenplays to journalism, crime fiction, science fiction. There's really something there for everyone to really show the breadth of what our culture has produced. Another aspect, I think, of tonight's conversation is the great knowledge that Elizabeth brought as a publishing professional and a writer to the selection process. I think everyone's sort of interested in how something gets in a book and how a book is created. And so she not only is an intellectual and a writer, but a very experienced editor and publisher. So she was bringing all of that knowledge to working on this book. So it's really a very, very special volume for us. If you liked this evening's program, we hope you'll consider becoming a fellow of the Library of America. We have quite a few of our fellows here tonight, in which we bring speakers of great distinction to interesting places that many people haven't visited before to discuss topics, literary and historical topics, and also to meet other like-minded people. In 2 weeks, we're going down to the Whitney Museum, for example, for a private tour of the Archibald Motley exhibit. Because he was very influenced by the Harlem Renaissance writers. So all the events are very different. You also would be supporting the mission of the Library of America, which is to keep this writing in the bloodstream of the culture. So we thank you very much for coming tonight. We're very grateful for the Union community's enthusiasm and cooperation in hosting this event. We're very honored to be here. And we especially thank Serena and Elizabeth for their wonderful remarks. We hope you'll stay for the reception and for more conversation. And thank you again.